For more than 30 years, the truth stayed quiet in this Kentucky town. The crime was never forgotten, but the person responsible was never named. People lived their lives, families grew older, and the one who committed this crime blended in, never questioned, never arrested. Until decades later, when a single arrest forced an entire community to confront a truth they never expected. In 1989, much of eastern Kentucky still moved at a slower pace than the rest of the country. The Appalachian foothills shaped not only the land, but the way people lived. Narrow roads wound through wooded hills. Small towns sat tucked between ridgelines, connected by highways locals knew by memory rather than signage. Generations of families lived within miles of one another, often on the same land their grandparents had once worked. This was a place where people noticed when something changed. Jobs were scarce but familiar. Many residents worked in nearby manufacturing plants, local service businesses, or industries tied to the region's long economic history. Others commuted short distances to surrounding towns. Unemployment was not uncommon, but community support was strong. People relied on each other in ways that were increasingly rare elsewhere. Family ties mattered. Last names carried weight. They told stories about where someone came from, who their relatives were, and how long they had been part of the community. Newcomers stood out not because they were unwelcome, but because everyone else already knew one another. In 1989, violent crime was not something most residents worried about daily. Law enforcement agencies were small and underfunded. Officers often knew the people they policed personally. That familiarity could be an advantage, allowing quick identification of unusual behavior. But it could also create blind spots. When everyone knows everyone, assumptions form easily. Serious crimes were rare enough that many officers spent more time handling domestic disputes, traffic accidents, or property issues than investigating violent offenses. Homicide investigations, when they did occur, were events that pulled resources from neighboring jurisdictions and demanded attention beyond what local departments were accustomed to managing. Forensic technology at the time reflected those limitations. In 1989, DNA testing was still in its infancy. It existed more as a promise than a practical tool. Most local departments lacked access to advanced laboratories, and even when evidence was collected properly, analysis could take months or yield inconclusive results. There were no digital databases linking cases across states, no genetic genealogy, no rapid comparisons. Investigations depended heavily on witness statements, physical timelines, and intuition. That reality shaped how crimes were investigated and how easily some could go unsolved. Community trust in law enforcement was generally strong. Officers were seen at church, school events, and community gatherings. They were neighbors first, officers second. That trust fostered cooperation, but it also meant few people believed someone from their own town could be responsible for something truly violent. That belief mattered more than anyone realized. When the crime at the center of this case occurred, it disrupted more than just daily routines. It challenged the idea that the community was insulated from the kind of violence seen elsewhere. People locked their doors more often. Parents worried more. Conversations lowered in volume when the topic came up. But even then, there was a quiet confidence that the truth would eventually come out, that the person responsible would be identified quickly. That assumption shaped early reactions. It also shaped expectations placed on investigators who, despite working diligently, were limited by the tools and resources of the time. Looking back decades later, it's easy to overlook how much investigative work relied on human memory rather than science. Witness recollections, personal relationships, local knowledge, and memory fades. Details blur. People move away. Some die. What remains are paper files, physical evidence, and unanswered questions. In 1989, Kentucky, no one imagined the case would stretch across generations. No one believed the truth would remain hidden for decades. But the combination of close-knit familiarity, limited forensic capability, and the assumption that the threat came from somewhere else created the conditions for silence. Not intentional silence, but the kind that forms when answers don't come quickly, and life moves forward anyway. This was the environment in which the victim lived. It was the community that searched for answers, and it was the setting that allowed a violent crime to slip quietly into the past, waiting for a future that no one could yet imagine. The victim's life, by all outward measures, was ordinary. That ordinariness mattered. In a small Kentucky community in 1989, routine was a form of reassurance. People noticed consistency. They noticed when someone followed the same schedule day after day, and they noticed immediately when that schedule broke. The victim was in her late 20s. She lived alone, but not in isolation. Her home sat within a neighborhood where residents recognized one another's vehicles and habits. She had lived in the area long enough to be familiar, but not so long that people stopped paying attention. Her days followed a predictable rhythm. She worked locally, maintaining regular hours that rarely changed. Co-workers described her as dependable. She arrived on time. She completed her responsibilities. She didn't draw attention to herself, but she didn't disappear either. Outside of work, her life was structured around simple routines. Errands were done on the same days. Groceries were purchased from familiar stores. She maintained contact with family members through regular phone calls and visits. Nothing about her behavior suggested secrecy or conflict. She had relationships, but none marked by public instability. Friends described her as reserved but social within her circle. She wasn't known to argue openly or maintain volatile connections. If there were private disagreements, they weren't visible to those around her. That lack of visible conflict would later complicate the investigation. When people looked back, they struggled to identify a single relationship that stood out as dangerous. In the days leading up to her disappearance, nothing appeared out of place. She attended work as scheduled. She was seen in familiar locations. There were no reports of erratic behavior, emotional distress, or plans to leave town. She did not cancel appointments or break routine. That consistency made what happened next impossible to ignore. The final confirmed sightings of the victim were unremarkable in isolation, but critical in hindsight. She was seen completing everyday tasks, speaking briefly with people she knew, moving through the community in ways that aligned with her normal behavior. Investigators later reconstructed her movements using these sightings. They established a timeline that showed no sudden deviation, no sign that she expected danger, no indication that she planned to meet someone unfamiliar. The last person known to have seen her alive did not report anything unusual. There was no visible argument, no sign of distress, no raised voices, just a normal interaction in a town where normalcy was assumed. That assumption shaped early responses. When the victim failed to appear where she was expected the following day, concerns spread quickly, but cautiously. At first, people offered explanations that fit the community's worldview. Maybe she overslept. Maybe her car had trouble. Maybe she decided to visit family without telling anyone. But as hours passed, those explanations lost credibility. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were left without response. Family members attempted to reach her through people she regularly spoke with. No one had heard from her. That absence was not normal. By the end of the day, concern turned to alarm. What stood out most to those who knew her was not fear, but confusion. This was not someone who disappeared without explanation. She was not known to miss work. She did not cancel plans abruptly. She did not ignore messages for extended periods. The consistency of her life worked against any innocent explanation. Investigators later noted that this immediate concern likely prevented a longer delay in reporting her missing. In many cases, disappearances are discovered days or weeks later. Here, the timeline tightened quickly. That mattered. When police became involved, they focused first on the victim's routine. They retraced her known movements. They identified the last confirmed sightings. They spoke with co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances. Again and again, the same descriptions emerged. Reliable, predictable, responsible. Those qualities eliminated certain possibilities. There was no evidence she planned to leave town. No financial irregularities suggested preparation for disappearance. No personal items were missing in ways that indicated voluntary departure. Her routine had stopped abruptly, and when routines stop suddenly, investigators consider intervention. Someone had disrupted it. The challenge was identifying who. Relationships were examined carefully. Friends were interviewed multiple times. Family members provided detailed accounts of recent conversations. Co-workers were asked about unusual interactions. No one reported threats. No one recalled recent arguments. No one remembered anything that felt dangerous at the time. That absence of red flags would later become one of the most troubling aspects of the case, because it suggested familiarity without conflict. Someone who did not raise suspicion. Someone who did not trigger Faye. The victim's final confirmed movements placed her in areas she frequented. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was being followed or coerced. Investigators considered the possibility that she encountered someone she trusted or at least recognized. Someone who did not cause alarm. In close-knit communities, recognition can lower defenses. People are less cautious around familiar faces. That reality shaped investigative theories from the beginning. The last confirmed sighting became a fixed point in the case. Everything after it was unknown. The hours that followed were reconstructed through inference rather than observation. And inference, without physical evidence, leaves space for doubt. For the victim's family, those final hours became a source of endless questions. What was said? What wasn't noticed? What seemed ordinary at the time but mattered later? These questions remained unanswered for decades, because once the routine ended, silence followed. And silence, in this case, lasted far longer than anyone expected. When she failed to appear the next day, concern spread quickly. At first, it followed a familiar pattern. Phone calls were made and unanswered. Messages were left with the expectation they would be returned later. In a community where people occasionally lost track of time or helped family at short notice, there was room for ordinary explanations. But as the day moved on, those explanations became harder to accept. Co-workers noted her absence. Family members attempted to reach her through people she spoke with regularly. Neighbors checked in, first casually, then with growing urgency. Her vehicle was not where it was usually parked. There was no indication she had left town. By the second day, the concern had shifted. Police were contacted to conduct a welfare check. Officers approached the situation cautiously, treating it as they would any missing person inquiry. They attempted contact. They checked known locations. They spoke with neighbors and family members to establish the last confirmed sightings and her recent routine. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. There were no signs she had planned to leave. No personal belongings appeared deliberately removed. No messages indicated she intended to be away. What stood out most was the absence of communication. She had not called. She had not checked in. She had not broken routine without explanation before. That absence narrowed possibilities quickly. As officers continued searching, attention turned to areas she was known to frequent. Locations she passed regularly. Places close enough to feel familiar, but secluded enough to be overlooked. It was there that the search ended. The discovery confirmed what many had already begun to fear. She had been killed. Authorities secured the area immediately. The scene was documented carefully. Evidence was preserved according to the standards of the time. Investigators worked deliberately, aware that the way the scene was handled would shape the entire case. There were no witnesses present when she was found. No one came forward to report seeing anything unusual in the hours or days before. The location itself raised difficult questions. It was close enough to suggest familiarity, yet removed enough to avoid attention. It was not a place chosen at random. It was a place someone could reach without drawing notice. That detail mattered. As word spread through the community, shock set in. This was no longer a missing person. It was no longer a welfare concern. It was a homicide. Residents struggled to reconcile the discovery with their understanding of the town. Parents kept children closer. Conversations lowered when the topic came up. The sense of safety that once defined daily life was replaced by uncertainty. For investigators, the moment marked a shift. The focus moved from locating someone who might still be alive to identifying who had ended her life and why. For the victim's family, the discovery marked the beginning of a different kind of waiting. Not for her return, but for answers. Answers that would take decades to arrive. In the days following the discovery, investigators moved quickly to establish a clear timeline. They began with interviews. Family members were asked to recount their last conversations with the victim, noting dates, times, and any changes in behavior. Co-workers were questioned about her scheduled interactions and whether she had mentioned plans outside her routine. Neighbors were asked about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual sounds, or activity that stood out. Every detail mattered. Investigators mapped the victim's movements using confirmed sightings and statements. They documented where she had been seen, who had seen her, and when those interactions occurred. Gaps in the timeline were identified and prioritized. Early theories reflected the limited information available. There was no clear sign of robbery, which shifted attention away from random theft. The absence of forced entry suggested the victim may have known, or at least recognized, the person responsible. Investigators also considered the possibility of an encounter that escalated unexpectedly. Despite extensive interviews, no witness could place a suspect with the victim at the time of her death. Each lead was examined, but none provided enough evidence to move the case forward. By the end of the first week, investigators faced a familiar problem. They had questions, but no answers. In 1989, forensic science could only go so far. DNA analysis existed in theory, but not in practice the way it does today. Testing was expensive, time-consuming, and often unavailable to smaller law enforcement agencies. Even when biological evidence was properly collected, there was no guarantee it could be analyzed in a meaningful way. Databases were limited. There was no national system capable of rapidly comparing genetic profiles across jurisdictions. Evidence that might be decisive today could only be preserved and stored, not fully interpreted. Investigators relied heavily on traditional methods: witness statements, timelines, physical observations. Biological evidence was collected carefully and catalogued, but its value was uncertain. In some cases, samples degraded over time due to storage limitations or environmental exposure. In others, the technology simply did not exist to extract usable results. What this meant in practical terms was delay. Evidence could suggest possibilities but rarely confirms them. Suspects could not be conclusively linked or excluded based on DNA alone. Without definitive forensic proof, cases depended on cooperation, memory, and circumstance. As months passed without breakthroughs, opportunities narrowed. The science had not failed. It simply had not arrived yet. As weeks turned into months, rumors began to replace facts. In the absence of clear answers, speculation filled the gaps left by evidence. Certain names surfaced repeatedly in conversations, passed quietly between neighbors or discussed in private. None was supported by proof, but repetition gave them weight. Local media coverage intensified in the early months. Newspapers revisited the timeline. Radio programs discussed possible motives. Reporters sought updates from law enforcement, pressing for developments that did not exist. Investigators were careful with their statements, aware that speculation could compromise the case. The pressure affected everyone involved. Detectives worked long hours, revisiting the same information with diminishing returns. Family members endured repeated questioning while trying to grieve. Community members struggled to reconcile fear with familiarity, unsure whether the person responsible was a stranger or someone they knew. Over time, attention waned. Stories moved off the front page. Public urgency faded. The case remained open, but momentum slowed. Emotional fatigue set in. Without arrests or new evidence, the investigation lost visibility. What had once dominated conversations became something people mentioned quietly, often followed by the same conclusion. They still didn't know who did it. Cold cases don't close. They fade. Detectives are reassigned. Evidence is boxed and stored. Files move from active desks to shelves where they are reviewed less often with each passing year. Leads dry up, and the silence becomes permanent. For the victim's family, time does not bring relief. It brings distance from the investigation, from answers, from the possibility of resolution. Anniversaries pass without acknowledgement. Questions remain unanswered. The case remains open in name only. And for decades, nothing has changed. Years later, science finally caught up. Evidence collected in 1989, carefully preserved despite limited technology at the time, was re-examined using modern forensic methods. Advances in DNA analysis allowed investigators to extract information that had once been impossible to interpret. For the first time, the evidence spoke clearly. Laboratories were now able to generate a complete genetic profile from biological material that had been stored for decades. This profile could be compared against modern databases, eliminating guesswork and narrowing possibilities. Initially, there was no direct match. The suspect was not listed in criminal DNA systems. That absence once would have ended the effort. Instead, investigators turned to a newer approach, genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA databases, genetic genealogy looks for partial matches, relatives who share segments of DNA rather than exact profiles. These matches can be distant, cousins, second cousins, or even further removed. By mapping those shared genetic markers, investigators began building family trees. Branch by branch, they worked backward through generations, narrowing the pool of individuals who could match the evidence. The process was slow and methodical. Each connection had to be verified. Each potential candidate was evaluated against known timelines and locations. Eventually, one family line stood out. The name that emerged had not been part of the original investigation. It belonged to someone who had lived quietly, without drawing attention, for decades. Science had not just reopened the case. It had transformed it. The name that emerged was not a stranger. It was someone who had lived quietly, without attention or suspicion, among the same people who had waited decades for answers. He had not been part of the early investigation. His name did not appear in old reports or rumor-filled conversations from the years after the crime. That absence was striking. For investigators, it meant the case had taken an unexpected turn. The person identified through genetic genealogy did not fit the assumptions that had guided earlier efforts. He had maintained steady employment. He had remained in the region. He had lived a life that, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. There were no public records linking him to violence. No history that would have raised alarms at the time. That was what made the discovery unsettling. The realization that the individual connected to the crime had existed in proximity all along forced investigators to reconsider what had been overlooked. Familiarity, it appeared, had masked opportunity. Investigators moved cautiously. They understood the weight of the moment and the responsibility that came with it. At this stage, the name represented possibility, not proof. Confirmation would require patience and absolute certainty. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, no crowd gathered outside. Just a quiet knock. It came decades after the crime, on an otherwise ordinary day. The kind of day that looked no different from the thousands that had come before it. For the man who answered the door, nothing in his routine suggested it would end with handcuffs. Investigators had planned the arrest carefully. After confirming the DNA match, they took steps to ensure there was no mistake. Additional evidence was reviewed. Timelines were checked. Records were re-examined to confirm the suspect's presence in the area at the time of the crime. Only when every question had been answered did they move forward. When officers arrived, they did not draw attention. Neighbors were not alerted. There was no public announcement. The arrest was conducted quietly, deliberately, and without resistance. In moments like this, the absence of spectacle is intentional. It reflects the seriousness of what is happening. After nearly 30 years, the case was no longer unsolved. For investigators, the moment brought a mixture of relief and gravity. Many of the original detectives were no longer with the department. Some had retired. Others had passed away. The arrest represented the conclusion of work begun by people who would never see it finished. The weight of that history was not lost on anyone involved. As word of the arrest spread internally, disbelief followed quickly. The suspect was not someone whose name carried notoriety. He was not known as dangerous. He had lived openly, worked regularly, and moved through the community without drawing attention. That fact shaped the response. When the arrest became public, the reaction was immediate. People searched their memories for context. They replayed past interactions. They questioned assumptions they had held for years. The idea that someone so familiar could be connected to a decades-old crime forced a re-evaluation of what normal meant. For some, the news felt impossible. For others, it explained long-standing unease they had never been able to name. Community conversations shifted overnight. What had once been a cold case discussed quietly now dominated local discussion. People asked how the truth could have remained hidden for so long. They wondered whether signs had been missed or ignored. But hindsight offers clarity that the present rarely does. At the time of the crime, there had been no obvious reason to focus on him. No reports, no visible conflicts, no evidence capable of pointing in his direction. That realization made the arrest harder to process. For the victim's family, the news arrived differently. The call they had waited decades for came without warning. It did not erase the loss. It did not restore what had been taken, but it ended the uncertainty that had defined their lives for years. Relief did not arrive alone. It came mixed with grief, renewed by the reminder of what had happened, and anger over the time that had passed. 30 years of unanswered questions could not be compressed into a single moment of resolution. Still, the arrest mattered. It confirmed what the family had always believed, that the truth existed, even if it had taken decades to surface. For law enforcement, the arrest validated the decision to revisit old evidence rather than dismiss it as outdated. It reinforced the idea that preservation matters, that even when science lags behind, patience can bridge the gap. The case became an example, not just of justice delayed, but of justice made possible by persistence. In the days that followed, attention turned to the legal process ahead. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence that spanned generations. Defense attorneys examined the methods used to identify the suspect. Courts faced the challenge of addressing a crime whose impact had never faded, even as time moved forward. For the community, the arrest forced a reckoning. People were reminded that familiarity does not equal innocence, that proximity can conceal as much as it reveals, and that some truths do not emerge until the tools to uncover them exist. The quiet knock ended 30 years of uncertainty, but it also reopened a chapter the town believed had been sealed forever. The arrest didn't just close a case. It reopened memories, challenged assumptions, and reminded the community that justice can arrive even decades late. What happened in this Kentucky town is not unique. Across the United States, thousands of homicide cases remain unsolved, not because investigators failed, but because the tools available at the time were limited. Evidence that once held no answers now carries information capable of identifying suspects with precision. This case illustrates the importance of preservation. Biological evidence collected in the late 1980s survived changes in technology, personnel, and public attention. It remained intact long enough for science to catch up. Without that care, the truth might have remained hidden permanently. The case also highlights the power and responsibility of modern forensic methods. Genetic genealogy has transformed cold case investigations, but it requires careful oversight. Each identification must be verified through lawful means. Each conclusion must be supported by evidence beyond genetic connection alone. Nationally, cases like this one have reshaped how law enforcement views unsolved crimes. Departments now routinely re-examine older evidence, recognizing that today's limitations may be tomorrow's breakthroughs. For communities, the lesson is quieter but no less important. Time does not erase truth. It delays it. And when justice finally arrives, it does not undo the past, but it restores a measure of accountability that once seemed impossible. This case stands as a reminder that cold cases are not closed chapters. They are waiting. Cold cases are not forgotten. They are waiting for the moment when science, persistence, and time finally align.